Actually, I started getting involved in developing open standards probably back in 1998, 1999. Prior to that, I had been involved in some standardization around Java in the very early days, some of the early JSRs. And, and I think it was a combination of the work that I was doing around XML and the work that led into sort of XML and web services. I started getting involved in some of the Apache projects early on, both initially as more of a consumer, and then providing feedback and input based on the work that we were developing, the SOAP and the WSDL and so forth standards, to the point where then I would start fixing bugs and so forth, and that sort of gave me the bug. I was already sort of a big fan of open generally, working on open standards as opposed to sort of the closed proprietary standards approach. And open source sort of really, I think, changed a lot of my thinking around how that whole process of developing standards could be done. This really sort of, my involvement really started when I started working in the W3C around some of the web services standards, whether it's SOAP, WSDL, and then some of the WS Splat specifications. And members of the team that we were in the W3C itself, in the work group that we're creating these standards, were off in Apache starting to develop the actual technology. And that's where, it was sort of being able to bridge both those communities. But it definitely was this sort of roll up your sleeves. If you need something done, you've got to, dive in and do it yourself. That sort of really attracted me to open source initially. I think that I recognized early on that doing anything in a sort of a closed proprietary manner in terms of developing software was a losing proposition, right? It's a slower process. You are limiting your innovation to the people that you have and so forth. And what I was perceiving is that when things were developed out in the open, they exploded. They would develop an order of magnitude more quickly, and then you'd have this blossoming ecosystem of sub-projects, related projects, tooling and so forth that would develop around them. And this was really evident in sort of the XML space, and then also in the web services space. That was when I really noticed it. And that's really what brought me to IBM, was I was invited to sort of come and bring some of that appreciation to IBM, and to help IBM sort of get it and be to be more involved and to take this beyond just the things that we were doing around Java and XML and apply that pretty much across the board. Mm-hmm. In terms of my career, and then I in the sort of the mid 2000s. I started doing industry standards around insurance and healthcare and supply chain and so forth, and took a little bit of a hiatus from some of the open source stuff that I had been doing around XML and web services. But coming out of that was the very beginning of the sort of the 2010-ish timeframe, 2011. Was the start of the beginning of our endeavors around cloud. And, again, we were sort of faced with a situation where we had, inside IBM, we had 6 independent, non-interoperable, the workloads weren't portable from one to the other, different prototypical virtualization platforms. And we were thinking, this could become cloud, right? And the problem is we had 6 of them. They're all different business units. They're competing against one another. Customers, analysts, and so forth really couldn't articulate a coherent business case for IBM and the early virtualization cloud space. And so that was when I started looking at open source as being an answer to what we were doing, and we started looking around at some of the various projects, and that that led me to OpenStack. And back at the time, OpenStack was still very young. It was fairly immature from a software development perspective, but you could tell that there was something special about it, and it was the community that really was what I think attracted us to the technology platform. The fact that Rackspace was able to, really sort of energize a whole lot of people around this set of ideas that, eventually became the core of OpenStack. But again, sort of going back to my days working with Apache, we recognize that if this is going to be successful, it really has to be open governance. So we could, we thought about this. And again, we could take these 6 non-interoperable, non-workload portable implementations and try to, consolidate them, unify them into a single coherent offering of an IBM data center virtualization / private cloud kind of a solution. Or we could adopt for this emerging technology in OpenStack that seemed to be garnering, both a community of dedicated developers, interest from a large number of vendors, ranging from, IBM and Red Hat and HP and EMC and so forth, and as well as the AT&Ts and SUSEs and Canonicals, and make a go of that, right? And so we managed to sort of convince the business that the right thing to do was to start new, right? and that helped significantly sort of transform IBM from a closed proprietary, software development shop to one that was really fully embracing open source. And I think that was a nice turning point for IBM. Well, so the first part of it was the actual, working with Rackspace and some of the other initial founders of the OpenStack Foundation to create that governance model. How are we going to, create a governance model that allowed the membership to have tiers of sponsorship and so forth, but at the same time sort of kept the business aspects of control of the organization, managing the budget and the staff and so forth, independent of the technical domain, right? Independent of, so we don't want the platinum members to be controlling the technical development simply by virtue of how much money they're paying to the foundation. And so there was that initial, crafting, working with the existing, because again, it's an existing community. They already are working in a certain way. And so we had to come up with an approach that they would accept, that the technical community would accept, where they aren't thinking that, oh, we have all these platinum sponsors coming in to tell us what to do. So that was sort of the, one of the first set of challenges was getting that part of it set up collaboratively. And then the other part was, okay, now we have that and we've convinced the business that this is what they should use for their offering. Now we have to convince IBM, you also have to start contributing to this project, right? You can't just sort of take the software and expect that it'll evolve in the technical direction that you want. You actually have to roll your sleeves up and contribute. And so, so we started ramping up a team in the sort of the open source group of let's get the beachhead established. Let's start, getting some people committing code into OpenStack projects. And then the second part was then running around the rest of IBM into the business units to get them to start contributing to the development, and then coordinating all of the different parts of IBM to make sure that our the point of views that we expressed into the open source community were at least somewhat consistent with one another, right? Not working at cross purposes to each other anyway. It's fundamentally important for two reasons. The first is if you're going to develop an offering around something, you have to understand how it's put together, how it works. You have to be able to debug problems, and then you also have to be able to fix them, right? When you've developed it proprietarily, that's your code base. You understand it deeply better than anybody else does. When it's open source, unless you're actively contributing to the project, you're not really going to have that deep appreciation for how the software works. You're not going to be able to debug problems quickly for your clients. And you're not going to be able to get bugs fixed easily for your clients either if you don't understand the code base. So getting people deeply involved is critical from that sort of perspective of being able to support the product that you're basing this offering on. The second part of it is that I think when you're when you're putting together an offering around open source, it's fundamentally important that you be seen as a partner to your clients, right? That the clients see you as an effective partner in that open source community, able to sort of help them achieve their particular sets of requirements or their needs in the community. And so being able to establish and say, yeah, IBM is one of the top end contributors to a given project, helps the customer be comfortable with the fact that you can be an effective partner with them in helping to move the technology in a technical direction that meets their requirements. Exactly. And it was sort of the same sort of thought process was ongoing, right? We had a cloud or the beginnings of a cloud. And but where developers were moving was beyond just provisioning VMs and deploying things into a virtual machine context to wanting to just focus on the application development, not so much on the infrastructure and the details of that. And so, we started looking around and we saw Cloud Foundry, and he said, again, another really good opportunity. And so I worked again with Pivotal, helping to establish the Cloud Foundry Foundation. And then again, the same sort of process of working to get that into IBM. So, now I've got a reputation inside IBM. I know how to sort of get these communities up off the ground and engage IBM in them and ramp up our contributions and so forth into those, build a community, build an ecosystem and so forth. And so, blockchain. So that basically, fast forward to 2015, and Jerry Cuomo approached me, and he said, "Well, look, we've been looking at this blockchain technology. We've been, exploring Ethereum and Bitcoin and a lot of the sort of Lightning and side chains and various other things, and but none of them really seemed suitable for the enterprise, right?" We talked to clients about it, and they had reservations about cryptocurrencies and so forth, didn't want mining. And so we started to essentially build our own proprietary blockchain technology. But Jerry, I think in his infinite wisdom, felt that if this is going to be successful, it can't just be IBM. It has to be open source. And so they came to me and said, what should we do, right? Should we just open source it as IBM? Should we contribute it someplace? Should we try and bring it to another community like Ethereum? And so I said, well, we should definitely open source it, number one. Again, a technology that's intended to be essentially ubiquitous has to be open source. And if it's going to be successful, it can't just be IBM. So I worked with the Linux Foundation because we had worked very closely with them most recently on Cloud Foundry and a few Node.js and a few other projects. And so I said, well, let's work again with the Linux Foundation. And so step one was actually sort of working with the folk in Jerry's organization on the proposal itself. So I had to make sure that they understood what we were going to be doing here. I think they trusted me, but by the same token, I had to sell the business on that we're going to do this. I suspect that to a certain degree, I didn't have to twist too many arms, but we did have to run it up the flagpole and make sure that Arvind and Ginny and so forth were okay with open sourcing what could potentially be a significant piece of IP for IBM. But they were fully supportive. So that's step one, is making sure you get the business support for something, for taking a significant piece of intellectual property and open sourcing it. And then step two was bringing it to Jim Zemlin at the Linux Foundation. And that's actually an interesting, so, I called up Jim and we arranged this, I was going to pitch him the idea. And his first immediate response was he started laughing. And I was like, I thought this was a good idea. He says, you don't understand. He says, I'm not laughing at you. He says, but you have to understand, you're not the first person that's come to me proposing a blockchain project at the Linux Foundation. And I said, oh, he says, you're about the 7th or 8th. He says, but, he says, the good news is, this is the first one that made any sense, right? Because, I mean, again, the focus of Linux is really on the enterprise, right? You know, and building robust enterprise software. And I think, you know, what he was trying to say is, well, but the others were not really, you know, sort of grounded in what are we going to do for the enterprise. So that was, I think, a key selling point, I think, for what we were proposing. Again, nothing's perfect. And, you know, I think we've been both successful, but not as successful as we might necessarily be. I think there's, again, this is one of those domains where we weren't the first, right, to bring something like that to the table. We were the first ones that really came out with an enterprise kind of a, you know, permissioned blockchain technology. And then others came along and they had, you know, started and they were leveraging existing technology like JP Morgan did with Quorum by leveraging the existing Go Ethereum, for instance, as a starting point. And so now we've got a situation where there's multiple competing initiatives, and they're all varying degrees of open and open source. And so there's a lot of confusion, I think, in the marketplace. And then not only that, but then even within Hyperledger, we have multiple frameworks. And I've been trying to push to get us to I don't want to necessarily call it a consolidation phase. I want to call it a collaboration phase, right? Where you know, instead of each project sort of focusing on its own initial set of problems and getting their initial releases out and focusing on the new features that they have to add to their thing, you know, we need to get beyond that to a place where people are thinking more collaboratively that, oh, if we all need to get and do some zero knowledge proof implementation, for instance, that we should collaborate on that, and then we can all integrate it into our various frameworks. And be thinking that sort of collaborate first, integrate second kind of a mindset. I think it's starting to happen naturally, but it's a stage that has to happen because there's just so many things out there right now, and there's so much hype and so much confusion in the space that, you know, I think people are still thinking, oh, I'm going to come up with this blockchain application and it's going to beat everybody and win the internets and whatever. I just don't see that happening realistically. But I think there's still people out there that have that sort of mentality of, I'm going to have to do this proprietarily, I'm going to build something and it's going to, you know, it's going to win blockchain somehow. Nothing, I mean, Bitcoin is open source, but it's not really open governance, right? I mean, it's hard for people to appreciate this, but the people that are maintaining the software don't actually have any power to make any decisions on their own, right? They've wanted to change the block size at Bitcoin for almost 2 years now. And the miners are refusing to let them do it because it would dilute the value of the Bitcoin that they win at the, you know, when they mine a block. And so that's not cool from their perspective, although again the price of Bitcoin has collapsed considerably, and so, you know, it hasn't really won because it's created its own sort of stasis of, well, we can't really move, we can fix bugs, we can, you know, we can tweak it here and there, we can change the computation, but we can't really make substantial changes, and so people are then sort of working around that, right, with side chains and various other approaches to how they could potentially improve performance and throughput and so forth. But they can't really change the core technology itself, that's part of the problem, I think. So, you know, everybody is, you know, in the blockchain space, I keep saying that everybody is sort of trying to solve the same problem. How do you achieve consensus at scale with high throughput and with low latency of confirmation and privacy? How do you solve for those 5 different properties? And there's always compromise. There's always, you know, you push down here and the other one goes up, right? So everybody's trying to solve this many-bodied problem, and it's really hard. And so they're trying different things out. And I think at the end of the day, most of the analysts are saying, the technology that ends up winning the sort of the blockchain wars, if you will, the blockchain technology race doesn't necessarily exist today. Now, some would argue, well, it doesn't exist in its current form, but it's probably going to come out of one of these places, right? Whether it's Ethereum or Hyperledger or something else, but it's the genesis of it is someplace already. I happen to think it's Hyperledger. I think we're at that level of openness where we have still sufficient opportunity to take the best of some of these things and start collaborating on and coming up with an approach that does address a lot of these things. Will it be Fabric? Well, I hope so, but I'm also happy if we in Hyperledger come up with something that's a sort of the best of all those worlds that we have in Hyperledger, and potentially other things that come along after. So I don't know if you know this, but recently Hyperledger and the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance. So let me back up and say that the Ethereum, there's an Ethereum Foundation that is essentially the place where they're effectively standardizing on the public Ethereum network and the technologies that comprise that, and coming up with the standards for how that works. People have been looking at public Ethereum from an enterprise perspective, and then they tend to sort of say, well, this is all really well and good. This is all interesting. I love to be able to sort of deploy contracts quickly and so forth. But I don't want cryptocurrency I don't want to have to pay to run my contracts. I don't want to have mining, is very, resource wasteful in many regards. And most enterprises are just not interested in that part of it. And so the public blockchain, also people want permission. They don't want to operate in a totally anonymous kind of a context. They want to have a certain amount of controls and better handle on security and so forth. So there's this sort of subset of the people that are interested in Ethereum that started working on projects like Quorum that are essentially a permissioned version of the Ethereum technology that you would run in a private network, typically private, not always, but typically a private network, some sort of a consortium. And out of that came the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance. But the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance isn't developing software. They're developing standards around how to, what should the protocol be for Ethereum and use in the enterprise? And how does that relate to the public Ethereum blockchain? And so very recently, within the past couple of months, the Enterprise Ethereum Foundation and the Hyperledger organization exchanged associate memberships with one another, right? So they basically, if there was a hatchet, they threw it down, right? They're putting their weapons down. They're saying, no, we're not competing against one another. I don't think they're ever really, I think people wanted to have, oh yeah, let's him and her fight, kind of a thing. But no. This always was the case, that they were focused on developing standards, and Hyperledger is focused on developing software. And so if there's a standard that's produced that makes business sense in the context of enterprise use of blockchain, then it's very likely that the projects at Hyperledger will go off and start implementing that. And so the collaboration between the EEA and Hyperledger, I think, is one that does make sense. We have a number of projects at Hyperledger that are sort of Ethereum based, right? We have the Burrow project. We have both the Sawtooth, Hyperledger Sawtooth and Hyperledger Fabric have integrated the Burrow EVM, the the Ethereum virtual machine into their respective frameworks. And so again, when it comes to thinking about, as the idea of using enterprise, using Ethereum in the enterprise starts to evolve and there are standards around it, it makes sense that those would be implemented in Hyperledger. That isn't to say that there aren't competitions between the people that are working in primarily Ethereum kind of a context, whether it's enterprise or not, and the companies that are working on various Hyperledger technologies. I think there is a certain amount of competition. But by the same token, again, there's value in the fact that these are all open source technologies that we can start building off of each other's successes. If this were all closed, this would be a very different story. But again, I think that the strength of Hyperledger is the open governance approach that we have, the licensing model that we have, and that ultimately that provides that sort of, I like to call these communities a safe place to innovate, a safe place to come and collaborate and develop innovations that you really couldn't do on your own or in another context. It was interesting. I was at a conference in Cleveland this past weekend, called Blockland, and this is a city that would like to become the sort of the blockchain capital of the world. That's what they say, right? It's a noble goal, and there's a lot of universities around there that are working on some blockchain things, and the fascinating thing from my perspective was to see all of these people that were using Hyperledger and Hyperledger Fabric in particular for a lot of different use cases. The one that seemed to sort of be resonating in the context of this particular conference, because there was an awful lot of academics there, there was an awful lot of schools and students there, there was some training on the weekend. The one use case that really sort of was resonating with a lot of people was certification, right? Being able to sort of put certificates that you might get from this or that university or college or some other secondary school, and record the fact that, Chris got this degree or this certification from thus and such a school, and then be able to use that as a proof, right? To be able to sort of then, when you go out and go get a job, you're not just presenting some falsified, piece of paper, but you're actually using something that the school has signed off on, and you can vouch for the fact that this is the legitimate credential that this person carries. Because I guess it's a real problem, for the schools, because a lot of times people are doing exactly that. They're going out looking for jobs and saying, I have a degree from Harvard or whatever, and they don't, because it's hard to prove the negative, right? It's like, well, I have a person with this name and they claim to have a degree, and they look and, well, I guess maybe, I don't know, but it is a real problem, right? It's a real use case. And it's one that I think is very suited to blockchain in particular. Identity is another one that comes up a lot. And we have Hyperledger Indy, and there's, again, all these permissioned contexts. There's an awful, there's a solid foundation of identity in all of these. And so that's another use case. Supply chain, right? So IBM's got a number of initiatives relating to supply chain. We've got the IBM Food Trust network with Walmart and Kroger and Dole Foods and Unilever and a bunch of others collaborating around food traceability, essentially, right? And with the recent outbreak of E. coli in romaine lettuce, right, that it really resonated with a lot of people. And then there's the Trade Lens project that we have, again, with the joint partnership with Maersk. So supply chain is another use case that really resonates, I think, with a lot of people. And a lot of this is because, in many regards, while it is already automated, there's a trust factor that's sort of missing, right? And so being able to sort of leverage blockchain to sort of add that level of trust when you're sharing information is an important discriminator. I think, there's an interesting, I don't want to call it a dilemma, but there's an interesting aspect to all of this, right? A lot of people will, the argument is, well, you can't make money selling open source, which is, tell that to Red Hat, right? $2+ billion a year business selling open source, nothing but open source. Everything they do is open source. The reality is, yes, you can. Right? And there's a number of factors that allow you to be effective in an open source context. First is, yes, you're open sourcing it, but you're extending your development community beyond your own four walls, right? You're inviting other people to come and help you innovate around this. So you're gaining in that regards. You're not spending as much on your development expense for a particular implementation of something. The second part of it is that you're essentially creating a de facto standard, right? And so you're creating especially if you get other vendors to go off and offer this, then you actually, you could say, oh, well, if I'm the only one that's selling X, then I have a differentiator, right? Well, that may be true, but what clients are looking for is they don't want to be locked into a vendor, right? And so being able to put something out as open source and get an ecosystem of offerings built out around that actually is an advantage, especially if you're able to deliver the best kind of support and so forth for the. And then, yeah, there's a certain, you want to add enough things around the edges to make it a little bit sexier, a little bit, we use our design thinking to put nicer user interfaces on top of things, and we've invested on some of the governance aspects around a blockchain in delivering that. But I suspect that over time that'll become commoditized, that'll become part of what's in the project. But I'm going to add some value add, and some of that can just be how effectively you are being able to support. Again, that means you're contributing to it in some way so that you understand how it's built and how to fix bugs and so forth. And that you're able to influence the direction and convince your customers that you're able to sort of help influence the direction that the technology will take. So, it's that conundrum of how do you get the business out of that old I have to differentiate mindset, right? You don't. You really don't. Actually, you have to differentiate on the sort of the non-functional pieces of it, right? How do you support the software? How easy is it for you to use it and so forth? Basically, if you go to hyperledger.org, right, there's a number of different pages, and then a number of different tabs. One of them is projects, right? So the first place to go is what are the projects that we're working on in Hyper. We now have 12 top-level projects, 5 of which are blockchain frameworks, and then we have some tooling and so forth to go with those. So I would start there, right? There's a number of places that you can sort of dig in. Each of those either has GitHub issues or a Jira that sort of outlines here's the issues that people are working on or that need to be worked on, right? So that's a good place to go. But then also each of the project pages basically should have a link to a wiki that would then sort of allow you to figure out, okay, so where do I go from here? If I want to contribute a bug fix, how do I do that, right? That's all linked off of those project pages. So that would be, I think, the best way to think about getting involved in all the different projects. What's special about IBM and blockchain is we've invested significantly on what are the use cases, right? What kind of solutions can we build with this, and building them and getting experience building them. We have connections throughout the globe, so we're able to bring customers and companies together to form these early, prototypical consortia. That's a value add. It's not in the technology, it's in the other aspects of things, right? It's in the support, it's in leveraging the IBM cloud as a platform for delivering the capability, all those things. And so it's that extra, being able to train people. There's tons more that have really nothing to do with the actual software itself, and that's the value add, right? I think most analysts are, putting IBM certainly up in the upper right-hand quadrant, if not at the top, when it comes to blockchain. And it's going to be an effort to stay there, right? There's a lot of competition out there from a lot of pretty effective companies, whether it's Microsoft or others. But again, it's not the software, right? That Microsoft is shipping Hyperledger Fabric right out of the box. Amazon, managed service, Hyperledger Fabric right out of the box, right? So you can make money out of these offerings. And so then the value is, what else do you have? Right? So for me, the priority for 2019, like I said, is that collaboration phase of moving beyond each project, focusing not exclusively, but mostly on their own particular releases and so forth, their own software, to focus on how do we start consolidating, for instance, how do we do smart contracts? Should we start building a common smart contract engine that we can all share, right, between the different frameworks? And then focus on integrating that into our respective frameworks. There's a desire for that. The challenge is everybody's already on a current course and speed, right? Everybody's, I'm implementing and I'm putting Fabric and Oracle and Amazon and Microsoft and IBM and everywhere else. And you don't want to derail that. You don't want to slow that down or, and so I think that the challenge there is getting enough of enough collaboration ongoing that's above and beyond just the core absolute required software development to enable that kind of innovation and that kind of integration and collaboration between the different projects. I think the desire is there, and so now it's a matter of making sure that we pull the right resources together to get that done.